I would like to acknowledge that today I'm speaking to you from the traditional territories of the Wasanic and Algonquin speaking peoples. And I would also like to acknowledge that you and our guests today are joining us from many places, near and far, and acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands.
Hi, everybody. Vic Fideli here, Ontario's Minister of Economic Development, Job Creation and Trade. The automotive industry is undergoing a significant shift, and Ontario is right at the forefront of that shift. Our province is uniquely positioned as a North American hub for developing and building the cars of the future. As the #1 clean tech cluster in Canada, we understand sustainability. Since Ontario does not generate any electricity from burning coal, we offer the cleanest energy mix of any auto jurisdiction in North America. In 2021, our electricity system was over 90% emissions free. Now, building on the success of phase 1 of our Driving Prosperity Plan, phase 2 now sets out ambitious goals for the auto sector over the next 10 years. Our plan will help transform the province's automotive supply chain, including the production of hybrid and battery electric vehicles and EV battery and component production. The Ontario Vehicle Innovation Network, OVIN, is rallying and supporting Ontario's talent, supply chains, innovators, investors, startups, SMEs, and global leaders towards a shared goal: becoming a global center of excellence. Over the last 2 years, our province has attracted $16 billion in transformative auto investments by global automakers. This includes more than $12.5 billion in electric vehicles and EV battery-related manufacturing investments. Landmark investments are coming to Ontario. That includes the historic $5 billion battery manufacturing investment by LG Energy Solution and Stellantis in Windsor to build the province's first large-scale electric vehicle battery cell manufacturing plant. A $1.8 billion project by ArcelorMittal Dofasco to replace its coal-fed coke ovens and blast furnaces with new low-emission technology, and a $1.5 billion investment from Umicore to build a first-of-its-kind industrial-scale cathode and precursor materials manufacturing plant in Eastern Ontario. These investments will provide good-paying jobs to the people of Ontario, revitalizing communities and fundamentally changing the North American automotive landscape. By 2030, 1 of every 3 automobiles sold will be electric, and we remain committed to sustainably growing Ontario's auto sector by building at least 400,000 electric vehicles and hybrids by 2030. Together, we will build a future-focused automotive ecosystem with the supply chain capacity, skills base, and technology clusters needed for the long-term success. We invite you to learn more about all that Ontario has to offer, and we wish you a productive discussion today. Thank you.
Bonjour and hello. Welcome everyone to IPON's Leverage Intellectual Property to Protect and Scale Your Auto Business event. I want to congratulate Intellectual Property Ontario, or IPON, on their launch and on this event, which will provide an overview for the first time of their service offerings to researchers, entrepreneurs, and businesses who are developing technologies for the automotive sector. As Ontario's flagship initiative for the automotive mobility sector, OVIN, the Ontario Vehicle Innovation Network, is driving economic development and catalyzing a future that builds safer, cleaner, and more efficient transportation in Ontario. As you'll hear throughout this hour, IPON is focused on supporting innovators in developing, managing, and commercializing their intellectual property. So enjoy this session, and once again, congratulations to IPON.
So for those of you that are joining today that aren't aware, IP Ontario is a new agency supported by both MCU and MedCat, obviously with Minister Fideli, and automotive is one of our key sectors that we'll be working and supporting. And our goal really is to help the IP ecosystem and help innovators in the Ontario ecosystem when it comes to their intellectual property needs and supports. We launched only a few months ago, and we have 4 technology sectors that we'll be supporting. The first one is medtech. The second is artificial intelligence. The third is the ORF recipients. And the fourth, last but not least, is the automotive sector. As Minister Fedeli talked about, this is a great investment that the province is putting into into the innovation fund that they're be working on, and what I really believe is that IP Ontario is coming underneath that and supporting where they're going and supporting all the organizations that are being funded by the government as well as private investors. So IP Ontario is really going to be structured around helping companies through IP mentorship, through IP funding, IP education, and then we'll be expanding out over time. We are running a pilot program, and part of that program is to help 40 or so companies in the next 6 to 12 months, and a portion of those companies will be automotive. So I am looking today to connect with companies and also connect with our stakeholders, our research and our innovators, and make sure we can be positioned to help support them. So what I'd like to do is, and I can talk more about IPON at the end, but what I'd like to do is actually introduce our speakers today very briefly. We have Brian, Reza, and Roger. What we're going to do is dive into an IP discussion, and then we can save some time at the end for more about what automotive launch means for IP Ontario and how we can be positioned to companies on the call today. I will note that Roger is joining us. I'll let him introduce himself, but just make a note, Roger's here on his own accord, so I do thank Roger for his time today. So Roger.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Roger Sadler. I'm an attorney at Mercedes-Benz Research and Development North America. I'm part of a legal and intellectual property team based in Silicon Valley, and we spend our days working with product developers and engineers and business strategy and investment teams in North America and internationally on identifying opportunities to work with small companies, startups, and university research teams to jointly develop and work on the technologies of the automotive future. And as the minister mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, the automotive sector is a super exciting sector to be working in for people like me who are interested in technology. The sector's been totally disrupted. Cars are what we refer to them internally, they're smartphones on wheels now, okay? They're totally transformed, and they're driven by software everywhere. And so it's a whole new world for lawyers and product developers and innovators like you. One other thing, I'm particularly excited to be here. I'm a proud Canadian, born and raised in the Ottawa Valley up in Eastern Ontario. And although I live and work in the United States currently, I love doing whatever I can to support Canadian innovators and startups. Small but mighty ecosystem, and we have every opportunity to get out there and conquer the world. So thank you, Peter, for having me here today.
Thank you, Roger. And Roger's being modest. He has a 20+ year history in licensing and venture capital and IP. So looking forward to some of his comments today to help come. So, Brian, perhaps I can pass the floor to introduce yourself and a bit about what you do as well.
Sure. So, hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Brian. I'm a patent lawyer and electrical engineer at Norton Rose Fulbright. My work is primarily with universities and scale-ups, and I do a lot of patent drafting around electric vehicles, charging technologies, and powertrains. I work day to day with inventors and the patent office to build robust patent portfolios. We've probably, I think, we've gotten around at least a few hundred patents through already in the space. So, we're right in the front lines of it. And I love it because every time I see a technology, it makes me want to go back to engineering.
That's great. Thank you, Brian. I'm looking forward to your comments as well. And Amareza, lastly but not least, I can pass the floor to you and have you introduce yourself and actually talk a minute or two about your company as well.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Amireza. I'm CEO of Mazlight. We're a small startup out of University of Toronto, and we developed a spray digitization platform, which is for any type of sprays, but we've been focusing on the automotive painting and solving a lot of the issues that creeps up in the painting. since it's one of the most dirty parts of the automotive manufacturing and generally a bottleneck in manufacturing itself. So we are helping that area. I mean, we have had a chance to work with a lot of government agencies, with university, with a lot of larger OEMs, and kind of bringing getting our IP out of university, and then getting the funding and support that we've got from OCI to get us to where we are today, and then constantly trying to grow. And we're very happy at where we are, but there's a lot of room for us to grow, and it's a lot of learning. And I'm very happy to be representing the startup world today. So thanks for having me.
Thank you. And I think from yesterday, the thing I learned is we're going to get hopefully a dynamic conversation today. Would love to hear everyone's thoughts on different parts of IP, but where that fits in the business, where it fits in their funding cycles, where it fits in their long-term planning. But maybe what I can do is set the stage today, and just actually open floor question on some observations of where IP plays a role in kind of your business story. And maybe, Roger, we can start with you and talk about it from the perspective of working for a multinational and what IP means for them in the auto space.
Automotive companies have been very well attuned to the importance of intellectual property and IP protection for decades. And so we're working with a relatively sophisticated team of IP professionals at Mercedes-Benz in Germany and around the world. And I would say that intellectual property in the collaboration arrangements I'm looking at and the potential startup investments I'm looking at, IP considerations are front and center. That's what typically attracts the eye of a large company looking to work with or invest in a startup. Are they developing innovative technology, and is that technology protectable or protected by IP? And that's what fuels the conversation when we start engaging with a potential investment or collaborative partner. Much of the conversation is focused on where their IP portfolio currently stands, where it's planned to be taken to over the next 5 to 10 years, and what structure they have in place internally to ensure that IP is a front and center to the startup's business plan, one of the key factors in the startup's business plan, and that they have the support they need to constantly be harvesting cool inventions and then obtaining robust IP protection for those inventions.
And maybe just a follow-up question on that, what would happen, or how would you think about looking at a company that would be sophisticated versus wouldn't be? Like, hey, thinking about working with organizations, what would you look for, and what would be some markers for you?
In terms of being sophisticated, I think an easy marker right up front would be when you're engaging with the company at first, to learn right off the bat whether they have pending patent applications or granted patents. And if they do, then that's a nice check mark. Then there will be further investigation into the scope and strength and validity of those patents. But it's a really nice check mark. If the answer to that initial sort of threshold question is no, that's going to raise eyebrows to a certain extent. And then we'll want to know a little bit more why. Is it just that you're planning on it, but you haven't gotten around to it yet because of all the things startup founders have to do? Or are you somehow just blindly oblivious to the importance of IP, in which case there's opportunities for us to work with you, try and bring you up to speed. But in other situations, that might be essentially a deal breaker.
And maybe just one last follow-up, and I'll let the rest of the team also panel here today jump in on their thoughts as well. Working with companies across the globe, do you see a difference in where Canadian companies are at? And how would you think about coaching or approaching companies when it comes to that, patent sophistication that you kind of alluded to?
One thing that I've noticed, this is just anecdotal to me, is that the startup companies that we talk to who are US-based usually understand and can speak to the importance of IP to their company's business plan and future growth. And I think that's because they have experience meeting with U.S. venture capitalists who will always ask those questions very early on in meetings. And so when we meet with Canadian startups, amazing technology, amazing founding teams, but some to a certain extent are a little less prepared for the upfront questions about what's your IP strategy, where is it in the business plan, who's in charge of it, what support structure do you have in place? This is just me guessing, speculating. It may be because those startups haven't reached the point in their company's growth where they have the ability to meet with US venture capitalists where they're going to get hit with those questions, and that will help there. That's just one difference that I've noticed.
Reza or Brian, any comments on that about, where you think the differences between Canadian companies or US companies may be, and how we can think about that, the supports we need to put in place to help us compete?
Sure. So I work with a lot of startup companies, and from a Canadian perspective, I also see some of the pain points that they face as they're growing and building out their IP portfolios. So one of the challenges I often see is that they're budget constrained to have to get good value for their dollar. And then the second aspect, I think this is actually the bigger constraint, is that there's a draw on engineering resources for them to work with us to build protection. And one thing that I will try to bring up as much as I can to support the community is that there's actually a lot of really good government programs out there these days. And there's ways to get funding resources and also ways to be smart about the way you build your portfolio so that you can get protection and make sure you have good placeholders in, make sure you've championed the right things, but also spread out the costs so that they can be incurred over the long run as opposed to over the short run. I'll pass it over to Reza now.
I agree with Brian. Funding is a portion of the issue that we have in Canada, but I think there's a lot of government supports, at least to start filing patents and so on. And so a lot of companies like ours, I'm pretty sure, are taking advantage of it. The challenge for me is that I don't have the funding to, if I'm working with OEMs or automotive, to take it to a global space, right? So I can help do a patent pending, get a patent for US, Canada, which is simple. But now if I want to go to Europe, it gets very complicated. If I want to go to China or Japan, it's the cost just becomes astronomical. And we don't have enough sophistication on the VC side of things in Canada, where the VCs are now very in tune to investing into hard tech companies that are working in automotive or these giant manufacturing or to industries that have been around for a long time. So the investments are not there to support it. And a lot of times, if you're talking to a VC in the US, it's a lot easier to have that conversation. The valuations are different. They understand it much better. So there is a little bit of that. But I see also there's a lot of movement on the VC side. It's ever evolving. Investors are, they're not purely now just investing in software. They're looking for other avenues because that market is starting to get saturated. So, and at the end of the day, we have to build physical things. So their portfolios are changing, and that's helping.
If I can actually jump back, you both, you talked a bit, you alluded to it. You talked about the global expansion and cost and things like that. Maybe I can get some comments from the team, like thinking about the auto market specifically, where startups and scale-ups need to be thinking about IP from a global perspective. And I know, Roger, you've had some experience globally as well, and I can chime in with some of my comments at the end. But, I think we talked about strategy and your business plan, and startups, we always, focus on getting out the door. But how does IP need to be positioned globally down the road?
From my perspective, when we're talking to startups and thinking about collaborating with them, we're looking at where the key markets are going to be in the next 3, 5, 10 years. And so that's easy. We want to focus on obtaining IP protection in those key markets at a minimum. And so just from my day-to-day life, that would mean robust protection in the United States, North America, okay? Robust protection in China, either the biggest or the second largest market for many automotive OEMs, and robust protection in key jurisdictions in Western Europe. I'm just naming names: Germany, UK, France would be a good starting point. So we would definitely want to make sure there was a plan, and we understand to Reza's point and Brian's point that if we're meeting with startups at an early stage, they won't have the budget to do that. But that's one of the things that a large automotive OEM can bring to the table, which is we can collaborating, we can help finance and fund that international focus for IP protection. And then we also have the infrastructure in place in terms of getting patents in globally, including in China, that the startup can help can leverage by working with.
Brian and Reza, any comments on the international side of IP as it fits in the auto strategy?
So I think Roger has a good point there, and there's no sense to just jump and go in every jurisdiction. A lot of times, what happened with us is we are working. Let's say if I'm working with a Japanese company, we are working with their innovation teams or factories in North America. So I want to make sure we have a good, robust patent protect us. We have NDAs in place and so on. And a lot of these things are business driven as well. So if I can show that I can grow and there's a business model for whatever we're selling, then, and what the scale of that is going to be, then that generally funds, through either the OEM or the VC and so on to go to the other jurisdictions. But it's very important to make sure that, in my mind, that you start with a strong holding. So you make sure you got all the corners covered and you're able to eventually go into the other jurisdictions and you don't run into problems down the road.
Brian, any comments before I wrap up? I've got another question I'm going to ask, but I'll maybe let you give the last word on the international piece.
Sure. Just from a strategy perspective, one of the things that we really like to think about is, what are we really trying to do with our portfolio, and like what is the objective we're trying to build, right? So when we're building a portfolio, oftentimes one way to essentially get good value for your dollar is to really identify which patent portfolio members are going to be the high priority ones, medium priority ones, low priority ones. And usually for me, just kind of as a ballpark, if it's a high priority filing and you're going to do lots and lots of jurisdictions, your costs are going to scale up essentially linearly based on the number of countries you file. So for us, when we're filing, let's say US, Europe, China, and maybe Japan, Korea, usually it's going to be around 5 to 7 times the costs. But let's compare it to a low priority filing. Let's say, it's like a useful feature, but might not be that useful or could be kind of speculative. Then it might make sense to just file US only and just keep sticking on US child applications and building up the scope that way, and that would be like a 1x cost example. So I think it's really important to be able to pick your winners and which ones are a little bit more speculative in the future, and then adjust your budgets accordingly. And then also there's a PCT application, which you can use to also stretch out the costs.
No, I was going to say, I think that the one piece I reflect on when I hear your comments is the one size fits all, just file patents and move forward is not a great strategy. You really have to think about where your IP fits with your market and shift your budget and your protection accordingly. Another piece, listening to the group here talk about, I'm really interested too to also have your points and thoughts on what are startups and scale-ups in Canada not thinking about when it comes to IP, and maybe there's some burning issues and trends that you're seeing in the marketplace specific for auto as well. I'd love to hear everyone's thoughts on where data fits in, because we could probably talk for an hour on where data fits into AI and how that's protected. So maybe I can just give that wide open question to the group about what's the trends and things that people are not really paying attention to today.
One of the things that I've noticed quite heavily these days is that there's a growing importance of kind of your non-traditional areas of IP, and it's something that people aren't thinking about that much. So things like design rights. So in everywhere else, industrial designs, but U.S. design patents. There's a growing body of litigation about that, especially over the ornamental shape, and it's not exactly always separated from function. So let's say you've got functionality that also looks good, right? It's an aerodynamic shape, but it's also a pretty shape. There's some litigation going on there. Data is a big one right now. It doesn't really fit in any of the buckets very well, but a lot of the manufacturing techniques, a lot of the automotive, from a design perspective, and also from a mechanical engineering perspective, electrical engineering perspective, a lot of things are now done using large amounts of data sets, and there's great value in both the raw data that you collect and also any kind of labeled data. And I'm finding that companies are starting to be smart about this, but they're not fully there yet. And the big thing for me is it's not just IP. You should also be layering it with contracts and those kinds of things as well.
Let me talk for a minute. about a trend that I've experienced over the past few years, which is kind of a cultural shift in the IP departments at large automotive OEMs. Traditionally, what we were patenting was hardware, physical devices, and we were very good at that. But in the past few years, most of the patenting effort is on software-related patents, and that is new to us. And so, and it's much more challenging to obtain robust software patent protection in the United States, at least. So we've been focusing our efforts on obtaining robust software patent protection. And that has involved things like bringing in different support mechanisms like Patent Prosecution Counsel, who are really adept at drafting strong, valid software patents. And when we're talking to startups that we're considering potentially collaborating with, because we've seen this trend and sort of had to play a little bit of catch up, we meaning the automotive industry generally, traditional OEMs, we're very well attuned to the importance. Hey, it's a startup. You need to be well attuned to the importance of how to obtain robust patent protection for your technologies. And to a large extent, in my day-to-day life, it's software-related technology. So we're really asking the hard questions about, okay, who are you? What's your plan for obtaining protection for the software you're developing? Which patent prosecution counsel are you using? If they tell us, we're using John Smith, a general practitioner down the street, because he can write patent applications cheap, that's going to raise eyebrows. We want to know that they're using good, experienced software patent lawyers to draft their applications. And then on data, well, Peter, that's maybe a topic for another conversation, because we could easily fill the rest of the hour talking about it. I would just say this. Data is all over the transactions I'm working on nowadays, given the nature of the startups we're working with. And it's not an easy question to answer, because protection of data doesn't really fall within the traditional buckets of IP protection. Like we think largely about patents, but when you're thinking about data, you're thinking beyond patents. And in my experience, protection of data is not so much patent protection, but rather drafting quite complex contract provisions that focus on access to data, rights to data, license to data, et cetera. Those are not IP provisions per se, but they're just contract. And it's a question I think most of us, and I'm sure Brian would agree, we're still trying to figure out.
The data part is very interesting for me, because with what we're doing, we actually, just getting data out of one OEM doesn't really help the OEM itself. So we need to actually get collaboration happening between the paint suppliers, which are all competing, with the robot manufacturers, which are all competing, and then OEMs and tier ones and so on. So in order for us to be successful, we also need to have access to various types of data to be able to do what we're doing. And it's an ongoing discussion. And I think there is a shift. The biggest challenge is generally in the IT department when I talk to them, because even in the pharmaceutical industry is the same thing. When we deal with pharma, IT departments is generally the one that puts the big brake on. But it's, as Roger said, you need to have strong contracts in place that describes how the data is going to flow, what they're going to get out of it, and so on. At the end of the day, what we're doing is very specialized to us. And if I give that data to somebody else, they can't really do anything with it. But in order for us to be successful, I need everybody to collaborate as much as possible. And we have different strategies to make sure that we can handle that in terms of safety, security of the data, where it's stored, and so on. Some companies are very strict about data storage and locally versus on the cloud, and so on and so forth. So it gets very complicated. It goes beyond patents, as everybody else is alluding to here.
Yes, Peter, Frezza came to me to talk about a potential collaboration. The data-focused portion of the conversation would be long, headache-inducing, and complicated because he wants our data, right? He needs it to a certain extent. And we want his data to a certain extent. And, a big company, there are many internal hurdles to being able to to share any data at all, and you have to have the appropriate protections in place, et cetera. So it's a very, very complex conversation.
Yeah, one thing we've done is we have forced ourselves to get our own hardware built, so we actually collect our own data. Because it's very difficult to say, give me the sensor data from every robot or every part of your facility you have, and make sure it's good data, and then at the same time integrating also. We are collecting our own data with our own equipment and so on. So that makes life a little bit easier, but still complex.
The piece that the last few years I've noticed there's been a big shift in discussion. We always talk about IP, and everyone talks about patents kind of as an IP being interchangeable, but the data piece I think is going to be interesting for companies in the next 3, 5, 7, 10 years. Having those contractual pieces, and from my perspective, and what we're working with at IPON is, it's not just funding companies and helping them support IP being here's money for patents, but it's also is those contracts, and I think companies do need support from that in Canada, and it is I'll talk about it later, but it is on some of IPON's funding plans. So, but maybe Reza, I can point the spotlight back to you. I'd love to actually hear a little bit about your journey, about how you got going and where your IP came from, and how you managed to bring that into your company. So if I can put you on the spot for that as well, I think it'd be interesting.
Give a little bit history about myself. So I did my PhD at U of T. I'm a U of T person, so I've been there for many, many years. And I did some work, but I wanted to. I realized when I was doing my PhD, there's a lot of companies coming in that have issues with their, on their manufacturing, and there was no real way of solving these problems. So eventually, I went back and wanted to do a postdoc to develop a product, solve that issue. So from the get-go, when we organized, we wanted to set up a company to do this, which is different than most graduate students and so on coming out of universities. And they're doing research that is a follow-up on what was already there, and sometimes there's not real plan of commercialization. In our case, we wanted to commercialize, so early on we didn't know what we were doing, so it took a little bit of time to actually figure out there's an IP there. Eventually, we learned that the best thing to do is actually work very closely to the university IP offices, because it's very complex and it's evolving, and they don't necessarily know how things are changing, and I don't know anything about it, so I need to learn from it. And with that collaboration and back and forth, we've learned over time how to manage to bring it out of the university into the company, the IP to come into the company, and how important it is for investors to see that, because every question I've had, even from angel investors, is always, where is the IP in the company? It's no matter how small the check is, they're always asking that question, especially when you're coming from a university background. There's a big concern there. But it's been difficult because traditionally you don't know, the professors are not trained to do that. The professor wants to publish, a graduate student wants to publish, and it works against you. And unless you're actually thinking out loud that, okay, I want to commercialize my technology, or there is something here, you got to start engaging with the right teams and kind of build a team, understand you want to commercialize, and take the right steps before you start publishing and putting everything in journals and conferences and so on. I think, we spend a lot of money in the universities, and which is fantastic from a government side of things, but we need to think really hard about how to bring that IP out of the university and make it useful. So I believe there's a lot of companies that can be come out of universities in the next few years, and they need to be actively thinking on how do I engage and learn about IP from the offices. There's a lot of support out there. There's government support. There's all kinds of people who have helped us along the way, but you just have to reach out and find these people and learn.
But if I can shift, I know, just jumping back to the trends, and it's really interesting to hear from Roger's perspective of the large corporation and where they're going, and Reza, where you're building your company. Interested to find out that middle ground. And one trend for me is around IP risk, and talk with companies and startups and CEOs about where their future potential risk is going to be. So in that middle piece, any thoughts on some trends around, whether it's non-practicing entities, or whether it's companies just enforcing their IP? I'd be interested to get the teams and the group's thought today on what are some of the IP risks that people need to be thinking about as they, Reza, you get past and you grow your company to a certain size, and Roger, your company's already thinking about it, and from your experience, and Brian, I'm sure you have companies that come to you in an IP panic. to say, what do I do with this letter I've just received? So interested to chat about that.
I'll ask Brian that question first. What do I do if I get the letter?
So you know you've made it when you get approached with these sort of hostile licensing inquiries. This is usually what happens, and it's a very, very commonplace. As you get to a particular size, you do get various parties coming out of the woodwork. Sometimes it's parties that you would expect to come out of the woodwork, so like licensing arms of major corporations, and sometimes it's like individual inventors who surprise you with some sort of patent or some sort of right that they say, you should be interested in it because, and they've got a undertone of a threat that, if you're not interested in it, they may sue you in the future. So when we work with our clients, this is a very, very common scenario that happens for us, and it's always a bit of a scramble to figure out, what have we said, who's saying what, and those kinds of things, and a lot of times it can be solved with just having very good standard operating procedures at a company to say, hey, anytime something comes up about this, always bring it to Ray's attention first, and then we'll triage from there, right? Make sure nothing that can be misinterpreted is said, by an engineer and those kinds of things. And then the other aspect is really then thinking about what do you have from your portfolio that could be helpful in this situation. So let's say that, it's a operating company that's coming after you, perhaps you've got some rights that you could potentially enforce back against them, right? And then the other side is really thinking about from a business resolution perspective. And this is always very painful for our clients when they've got let's say even it's like a spurious allegation against them, just the amount of money and effort it takes to fight off the allegation, how much it's going to draw away from their engineering resources and time. Sometimes it's better to settle in it. That's a very, very sad part of these things. What we've seen is a bit of an arms race going on these days between innovators and companies trying to exploit their intellectual property rights, often patent trolls or non-practicing entities. And we've seen things such as the non-practicing entities starting to get litigation funding now from external funding sources and being very, very aggressive in the way they structure the businesses so that they're a little bit litigation proof in the event that they lose. And it's really hard to counterclaim against them. And then we've also seen on the other side, and I think Roger will know this way more than me, but things where people are getting together in collectives now in terms of like innovators are buying into these patent pools or innovation networks. And even further that we've seen some innovation networks and some of these organizations actively trying to invalidate patents in certain spaces as well. So you'll see them using tools such as an inter partes review in the US, which is a procedural ability to attack the validity of a patent, primarily on prior art grounds. And then we're also seeing some companies actually going after declaratory judgments, essentially saying that this patent is invalid whenever they get a threat. So we're starting to see pushbacks both way. And it's interesting to see how this is going to shape out over the years. But a large amount of litigation these days now is actually from non-practicing entities, the patent trolls, essentially. And we're starting to see a pretty big uptake in that. So I would say it's very, very commonplace for most companies, unfortunately, now to be solicited with a licensing threat.
So you've made it when. And then Roger, your thoughts on maybe some of those organizations, and you can describe what they are. I know a few, but you probably know some as well.
What Brian said is, I just want to echo that, at least in the United States, I think 80+% patent litigation is NPE driven. Certainly that was my experience and has been my experience. I was a patent litigator for years at a law firm in New York City. And then I worked for some large global tech companies. And the vast majority of our litigation was US patent troll litigation, defending that. So please, all of you innovators and entrepreneurs on the call today, the opportunities for you in North America and south of the border in the United States are limitless, but you need to be aware that with those limitless opportunities, there is risk, and one risk comes from the IP front, and it's patent litigation. Whether it's a patent troll who's going to see that your startup starting to gain traction, or you're just on the verge of an IPO and then going to file a well-timed lawsuit to try and mess with that IPO and force you to settle. They're out there. So patent trolls, and then other startups. I told you earlier, this US startup ecosystem is well attuned to the importance of patenting. So every day that you're thinking, do we have the budget to patent? Should we be patenting? There are thousands of startups around North America who are already drafting patent applications that could read on your tech. So watch out for them. And certainly, I would say from the perspective of a large automotive OEM, we see the risk of patent litigation increasing because I mentioned earlier, we view cars as smartphones on wheels, and anyone who's attuned to the IP ecosystem over the past 10 years knows that the smartphone world had thousands of patent litigations, and we expect owners of software patents to slowly turn their attention to the next smartphone, which is automotive.
Is there some organizations you recommend companies look at, and
Oh yeah,
no acronyms you actually need to spell them out as well?
Oh no, Peter, thank you. I was a co-founder of one such organization. Thank you, Peter. It's called Lot Network, License on Transfer Network, and it's an anti-patent assertion entity-focused nonprofit organization that companies can join and join a community that will help protect you against the threat of patent troll litigation. I won't go into the details of that, but I can tell you we launched in 2013 with 4 members, and now we have over 3,000 members from the largest companies, including my company, to hundreds and hundreds of cool cutting-edge startups in the US and Canada. So Lot Network, blatant plug here, that's something you should look into because it's not for profit, so it's very affordable for young startup companies to join, and the protections you will receive will pay tremendous dividends. So Peter, thank you for reminding me.
AST, did the AST get a plug as well?
They did not, but they certainly could. Allied Securities Trust, they have a very fine attunement to the world of IP and patent-focused transactions, and so they can see patents that could cover your company's technology being transacted, sold to a patent troll, and AST has the ability to go in and remove those patents from the market by buying them up. And they do other things too, but AST's another cool one. And then there's organizations like Unified Patents, which you should look at too. And Unified is cool. They have subgroups, and I'm confident there's an automotive subgroup. And Unified can help you by targeting potentially dangerous patents that may have invalidity issues by filing focused inter partes reviews at the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. And they have a very, very strong track record of taking out bad patents.
And I'll also give a plug for those clean tech companies on the call, the Innovation Asset Collective, and that's also funded by ICED, and the federal government is also has supports in place. And I think it's interesting to hear all these risks and woe is us, the sky is falling and IP is going to crush us. But there is some very sophisticated supports out there, both government funded and nonprofit and privately funded, so things like the Lot Network and AST, and as well as IAC. And then I'll be talking about IPON in a few minutes. I'm watching the time, but perhaps I can just give the panel one last go around to say, is there any tangible points or lessons learned or things you'd encourage companies to think about when it comes to IP? And then I can move on to chat about IPON after that.
Get engaged with any IP office that you're involved with any of these academic organizations, and build a team and start networking. And the more you go at it, the better it is. You're going to learn a lot of things, and make sure you have the right steps you take, when you're dealing with large corporations. I know NDAs and things like that take a long time, but without those things, we cannot do anything. So just make sure everything is well protected. Yeah, don't get too excited, when you're talking to customers, to spill the beans. Just keep pushing. And there is, I think, even as a small company, there is a path for getting what you need and protection you need against a large corporation. It's just you got to work at it and make sure everything is lined up and you're talking to the right people and convince them to do it, because it's a lot of work on the OEM side to even give you an NDA. But if you talk to them and convince them, it usually happens. It just takes time.
Just from a patent lawyer perspective, and this is the number one thing I would tell to my clients, is that you need an IP champion that's not your IP lawyer. they're not your external IP lawyer. You need someone within the organization who can help drive and really push the conversations and really champion the development of a portfolio and really understand strategically what you're trying to build. And a lot of this is just making sure that there's a good IP culture in your organization. So making sure all of your engineers, before they publish any papers, before they have any discussions, make sure they're always thinking about what can we file, how can we build up the IP portfolio. There's a very, very heavy impetus to always think about development, especially in Canada. And IP is often pushed to the side, and it's better to have it integrated into the processes themselves, as they're talking and building out technologies to make sure that they're understanding what's the secret sauce to this, how are we going to protect it in the future, what are the different layers of protection. And then finally, it's always good to think about what programs the government has to support some of the strategy and development efforts as well. One big one is one from IRAP. It's called IP Assist, and it's very, very, very good for Canadian startups. And I think it's actually a really fantastic program.
I would say this: there's a direct correlation between the size of your patent portfolio and the valuation your startup will receive. And there's also a direct correlation. There are studies showing that the size of your IP portfolio impacts the time to exit, IPO or otherwise, it positively impacts. So that's one reason to keep IP front and center. Number two, having a robust IP protection will help you attract the funding you need from venture capitalists or corporate partners like, in this case, large automotive OEMs. And number three, robust IP protection, like we just mentioned, can be helpful when you enter litigious markets like the United States. For example, if you enter the market and direct competitor startup X sues you immediately in the Eastern District of Texas, if you have patents that you can counter assert, that can resolve the lawsuit quite quickly. So having patents will help you in the long run on the IP litigation defense front too.
Thank you. I appreciate everyone's time today. I'll maybe like to actually turn a bit to IPON, back to IPON and some of the supports that IPON is being developed. I am happy to announce today we are going to be opening up some supports for some selected Ontario-based auto tech companies. And that's going to be published on our website and pushed out later today, that our eligibility. But what we are looking to do is, the team here talked about all the challenges that companies have, and the team also talked about the importance of needing IP. And now IPON is here to be able to provide some of those supports. What we are looking for is to actually start working with companies as quickly as possible. And we're looking at working with automotive companies, and that for us, auto tech has a pretty wide definition. It's data, mobility, or connected technologies that could be embedded inside an automotive technology. Roger talked about smartphones on wheels. So I know there'll be some companies that are working in telematics or other digital mobility pieces that can be used in the auto market. And we're looking at connecting with them and how we can support them. The second piece is the electric vehicles. So low carbon, alternative power, anything that can be used to support the vehicles. I know Minister Fedeli talked early on today about the investments the province is putting in batteries and electric vehicles. So again, we're looking to support organizations that are doing advanced technology in that area. And that also extends to automated driving. So, whether it's sensors or fully automated vehicles or partially automated vehicles or technology that helps enable that. Again, I think there's some overlap with the telematics and digital, but that's another type of organization we're looking at supporting. And the fourth type is advanced manufacturing. So some of the work that Reza is doing today, how are we actually putting advanced manufacturing processes into place? I think if we can support that, it's not just about the technology widget that goes inside the car that's driving around, but also how can we actually build advanced manufacturing technology in Ontario, and how we can be supported for that. So for organizations that are either developing IP in these sectors or are actually supporting companies, so tech transfer offices that may have some IP that they are licensed out to some startups and scale-ups that are in Ontario, we would like to hear from all of you. And we're going to be working through over the next 2.5 weeks to select which companies we can work with for the rest of our beta test. So with that in mind, I'm going to turn my thanks back to the panel. I do, if there's any questions, we can pop them in the chat and we can go through them in the last 2 or 3 minutes we have. But I actually did get one question for Roger that was texted to me. So if Roger, you can jump back on the call, and maybe Brian and Reza, you're welcome to join as well. But the question was around thinking beyond kind of IP, and you talked a lot about patenting. Where does trade secrets fit into that program and that plan and that cycle as well? So I know you talked a lot about, yes, you have to have a patent, but where does trade secrets fit in? So maybe I can leave, Roger, you with that last question, and if there's, before we wrap up.
I would say that trade secret is an area of IP protection that should not be ignored. And you could find some very recent examples of instances where it was ignored and it resulted in litigation, high profile litigation. So it should not be ignored. But practically speaking, my experience, startups don't have the infrastructure in place to adequately protect trade secrets. Often the confidentiality protections and the sophistication to make sure that when they're going out searching for funding or collaborative partners, that the trade secrets that they have are adequately protected contractually, et cetera. And really, from an investment perspective, the signal that will be strongest to the potential investor or collaborative partner comes from patents. Trade secrets, much less so. We understand that you might have trade secrets, but from our investment perspective, that's a minor factor. We want patents and a robust patent.
Any other comments or that? If we're right at time, there is one question that's been sent to me. Is if, and Roger, you talked about this, so maybe you can spend 30 seconds on it, Brian, as well. If you have trouble paying for patenting, how can you afford patent litigation? Maybe you talk about litigation finance as what the marketplace is looking at.
I was just going to say patent litigation. It's a great question, and I don't have an easy answer for you. Some of you might be interested, if you don't have direct experience, to take a patent case to trial in the United States. You're talking $3 to $5 million in litigation expenses, and probably 2 to 3 years of a huge suck on your engineering and product development and company management resources as they respond to that litigation. So it's a game that is stacked against smaller, less funded companies for sure, and certainly NPEs will take advantage of that, knowing startup A is not going to have $3 to $5 million to devote to patent litigation, so they're more likely to settle very quickly. It's a real problem. Maybe Brian has an example of how to make that problem more affordable.
You have to have a really thick skin when you're playing this game. They will pick on you on purpose, and the craziest part is that they've designed their game theory strategy so well that it's designed so that, like when these kind of non-practicing entities come after you, what they do is they often give you different tiered pricing depending on how far in litigation, how early you're willing to settle with them. And it's really designed oftentimes as a nuisance charge. So they'll ask you, this is the amount you would typically cost your lawyers, even just to do basic searching to see whether or not they even have a case. And they'll ask you like $30, $40, $50,000, right? And then you ignore them, and then they raise the price. You ignore them, they raise the price. So it's really, really stacked against you. And sometimes, unfortunately, it does make sense to pay them to go away early. As Roger mentioned, these innovation networks and these patent pools and consortiums really help. So that's one good way to start building up ways to fight these things off. And then the second aspect is to sometimes it makes sense to engage in pre-litigation and do your due diligence and say, hey, do they have a case or not, right? And that really informs your strategy going forward. Let's say you want to enforce your rights, on the other hand. There's different ways of doing that. They're fairly expeditious, and similarly, you could use non-court approach, non-court type methods to be able to get licensing deals and those kinds of things too. So a lot of it's also in business negotiations as between businesses as well. So let's say you want to get some value, you would reach out to a client and find ways to work with the other company to pay a licensing fee or royalty.
And Peter, one more comment, so I don't leave people thinking that there's no hope whatsoever. In addition to what Brian just said, in the United States, you have the ability to file potentially a petition for post-grant inter partes review, an IPR, to target the patent that's being asserted against you. And that is one tool that's much less expensive than patent litigation, where you can sort of take the fight back to the patent asserter and say, okay, cool, we're going to put your patent into inter partes review at the patent office, and we'll fight it out there. And that can sometimes create settlement leverage in your favor. So IPRs is a tool in your arsenal. It's much less expensive than full-on patent litigation.
I wanted to ask that question because it does come up often, and we talk about the sky is falling. You need IP, but IP is expensive, and there is options and opportunities down the road to be able to help support that. Again, IP Ontario is being developed and structured to help support companies think about this and get their IP structured and in place for Ontario. So I'm very much looking forward to working with as many Ontario-based auto tech companies as possible in the next coming months. So please reach out to us if you're interested in working with us and getting some of our supports. I think our first cohort is going to be approved for up to $25,000 worth of IP funding, and that can be used for, not just patents, but also the contract and the data pieces that Roger and some of the other team talked about. So very much do feel that we can help organizations get a good jump start, so they're in a good position down the road. My thanks again to the panel today. I do appreciate your time, and everyone that spent time today on the call. Thank you very much. Have a good night.